You're watching Reality Check. Our big focus, the Supreme Court is hearing a petition filed by a BJP leader who wants parties who promise freebies, handouts, to lose their license because of the harm these handouts cause to the economy. This PIL has the backing of the central government. In fact, the attack on handouts has been led by the Prime Minister himself, who in recent multiple speeches has been targeting handouts using the analogy of the free distribution of Revdis, a North Indian mithai, like in a speech he gave in July in Uttar Pradesh at the inauguration of a highway.
रेवड़ी कल्चर वालों को लगता है कि जनता जनार्दन को मुफ्त की रेवड़ी बांटकर उन्हें खरीद लेंगे। हमें मिलकर उनकी सोच को हराना है। रेवड़ी कल्चर को देश की राजनीति से हटाना है। साथियों, रेवड़ी कल्चर से अलग हम देश में रोड बनाकर, नए रेल रूट बनाकर लोगों की आकांक्षाओं को पूरा करने का काम कर रहे हैं।
Now the Prime Minister didn't stop there. He's taken several similar shots at other events. Other BJP leaders too have stepped in, claiming that handouts is damaging economic progress. At many levels, this is a curious line for the Prime Minister and his government and indeed the BJP to take. For one, there's been widespread political and economic consensus in India for decades on subsidies, doles and even free entitlements as safety nets in a largely poor country. Some benefits are not considered handouts but as rights, which have been passed into law, like the National Food Security Act, which guarantees subsidized grain to the deserving. Equally, in other areas like health and education, there is consensus that state-funded subsidized services in these areas are not a drain on resources but a vital cornerstone of economic progress. How does India grow and compete globally unless we have a healthy, educated citizenry? But in his barbed comments on Revdi culture, the Prime Minister or the BJP has never defined which party he's referring to or the kind of handouts he's targeting. Does he mean outright free entitlement or doles or subsidies? But it's safe to assume that the BJP's primary target is the Aam Aadmi Party, emerging as a key challenger to the BJP, given AAP's political growth and electoral success believed to be largely linked to their promise of free or subsidized entitlements. Its governments in Delhi provide certain quantities of free power and water. Limited free power promise was also extended to Punjab, which they won earlier this year. Also free education and medical treatment in government institutions and a monthly stipend of 1,000 rupees for young women. In the coming Gujarat elections, AAP has promised again limited free power and stipends to women. Now it could be a subject of debate on whether AAP has redrawn the line on entitlements, extending it to areas like power, similar to debates sparked by parties in southern states which have promised and pioneered the practice of free mixies, TV sets, laptops and so on. But it's baffling to see the BJP wade into this debate, given that its own political success has been on the back of mega welfare schemes, often with the PM's personal branding, ranging from outright free handouts to subsidized benefits. Let's look at the prominent examples. Prime Minister Kisan 2018 announced 6,000 rupees cash a year to farmers, a total budget of almost 70,000 crores. PM Garib Kalyan Anna Yojana in 2020, 5 kgs free food grains every month to the poor during the pandemic. Again, a massive budget, 80,000 crores. The Swachh Bharat Abhiyan of 2014, 12,000 to 15,000 rupees subsidies for building toilets, a budget of about 7,000 crores. This is for Swachh Bharat Rural. The Prime Minister Ujjwala Yojana announced in 2016. Phase 1 was free cylinders to crores of households. Phase 2, 1 free refill along with the free stuff. The Prime Minister Awas Yojana of 2016, 1.2 lakh to 1.5 lakh rupees subsidies for building houses, a budget of almost 50,000 crore rupees. These are all 2022-23 period budgets. It's the same in BJP ruled states. Just take these recent announcements. BJP governments announced ahead of the Uttar Pradesh elections of 22. BJP promises including free scooties to girls, free power to farmers, free LPG cylinders. In Madhya Pradesh, March 22, a one-time waiver of electricity bills valuing about 6,400 crore rupees in Himachal in April of this year, 125 units of free electricity to consumers, all BJP governments. And here are BJP leaders themselves talking up some of these promises/decisions.
किसानों को 5 साल तक सारा बिजली का बिल भरना नहीं पड़ेगा, फ्री ऑफ कॉस्ट बिजली देने वाला। माताएं बहनें यहां बैठी है, जिनके पास भी उज्ज्वला का गैस है, होली और दिवाली में एक गैस आपको 2 गैस साल में मुफ्त सिलेंडर मिलेंगे मित्रों, मुफ्त। 10 तारीख को काउंटिंग है, 20 को होली है, 10 को भाजपा सरकार बना दो, 20 को मोदी योगी सरकार आपके घर में गैस का सिलेंडर भेज देगी।
2 साल फ्री में दिया था 80 करोड़ लोगों को पूरा राशन, दुनिया में एक भी ऐसा देश नहीं था। अब इसको खर्चा आएगी कि नहीं, 2,71,000 करोड़ रुपए खर्चा आया, वो कहां से लाएंगे? तो इनकी एक मांग होती है कि रोल बैक टैक्सेस, यानी एक तरफ उत्पादों को कीमत दो, दूसरा टैक्स मत लगाओ और लोगों को सस्ता दो।
Now this propaganda around handouts is for good reason. The BJP's welfareist push has by all accounts been electorally rewarding, massively. Clearly people like freebies and handouts and are rewarding all parties that promise them, including the BJP. So why is the BJP then attacking freebies, other than political point scoring over its rivals? In fact, some say the debate should not be on freebies or whether they're good or bad, since almost all parties practice it, but on how many governments led by the centre are retreating from the traditional role of providing services like health and education, and instead taking the easy way out of distributing handouts. What the former chief economic advisor Arvind Subramanian has called the new welfareism of the Modi government. As he writes in a recent piece in the Indian Express, this new welfareism means that the state does not prioritize the supply of public goods such as basic health and primary education as governments have done around the world historically. Instead, it has entailed the subsidized public provision of essential goods and services like bank accounts, gas, toilets, electricity, housing, and more recently water and also plain cash. Presumably, since providing quality health and education are tough and hard to measure, and it's a long-term process versus, say, toilets, which has immediate political benefits and it can be counted, but then that doesn't create the base. Without health and education, you don't create the base with which people can empower themselves and stimulate growth in a dynamic economy. All right, joining me tonight on the show is Arvind Subramanian himself, former chief economic advisor with Brown University currently. Thank you so much for joining and for patiently listening into my somewhat lengthy introduction. But Arvind Subramanian, is that the crux of it? That are you also somewhat perplexed as I was when we saw this kind of targeting of freebies, particularly by a government that has actually done very well on welfare? And should the debate really be about the very important point you make in your piece on this new welfareism, that we shouldn't be debating this, whether freebies are good or bad, but the fact that the government's center, including, are retreating from providing these essential services like health and education and choosing this easier substitute instead of handouts?
Yeah. Thanks for having me on the show. So we're wading into, vast and complex territory here.
Okay.
So I think let's see.
Let's take it one by one. Yes.
Yeah. Let's start. I think there are two, things that we should clear up front are things we should not be, discussing. One is the definition of what is a freebie. I think nobody is going to win this debate because basically one man's freebie is another man's essential. Let's say you give a power subsidy to a farmer, it's lifeblood for him, but for an environmentalist, it's kind of, pretty alarming to give this because it leads to declining water tables. Second, as you said, everybody is sinning in this. Every party, both the center and the states are sitting. So I think
Yes.
there's, so nobody has any moral high ground on this, as you quite rightly said, right? The third thing that doesn't get said in this, the discussion of freebies often has this kind of elite middle class bias where you focus on the, freebies given to the poor. And in fact, our system completely overlooks, the freebies that the middle class gets, in spades. In 2015-16, Mr. Arun Jaitley, when he was finance minister, he asked me to catalog and quantify what the freebies that the middle class was receiving in India. And in the economic survey of 2016, we actually cataloged this. There are all kinds of things that we give for the middle class. I mean, to begin with, so many middle class taxpayers don't pay any taxes, for example. The other thing is that, these public sector enterprises are making huge losses, which keep getting, financed and funded. Those are, big freebies. When corporates get write-offs, for example, they may be for a reason, but they're also freebies. And we found that these, freebies could be 1 to 2 lakh crores. So it's a kind of mug's game to decide, nobody from the outside can decide what's a freebie or what's not a freebie.
No, that's
that is
interesting,
why it is essential that all these things be debated, discussed, and be part of the democratic political process, rather than, the Supreme Court or some outside expert saying, this must be done, this is a freebie. I mean, that's just a fool's errand. It has to be part of the democratic political process. So then that leads to the question that you raised. Freebies in some ways are a symptom of a problem, not the problem itself. And what is that underlying problem? As you quite rightly said, remember, one has to be really fair here, that both the center and the states, you say, have retreated. That's actually not quite right, Vasu. It's actually, health and education, no government, center or state has ever really provided effective public health and education over our 75 years.
Right.
I think the one exception, to be fair, is the Aam Aadmi Party, which actually said, judge us on our record on providing health and education. But apart from that, the history of India is a sad story of health and education being completely neglected. So it's not a retreat from that. They've never really provided that. So as you rightly said, both central and remember, health and education are state subjects. So it's not just the central government that's made mistakes. It's also the state governments that haven't done this. So the question is, it's a symptom of a problem, and the underlying problem is that, the center maybe they can't provide employment and growth. The states cannot provide health and education. So what do politicians do? They're not able or willing to provide these essential, what we call public goods, health, education, infrastructure, employment, which benefit a lot of people. Instead, they, promise to deliver the things that they can deliver, which is easy to deliver, whether it's toilets or cash or fertilizer subsidies, whatever. So it's a symptom of a problem, and the underlying problem being that, the Indian state has historically not been very good at providing these big essentials of, health, education, growth, employment. One exception, one public good that I think the Indian state has become pretty good at doing is to provide infrastructure. I think the last 25 years, beginning with the Vajpayee government, roads, connectivity, ports, airports, all the things that are very important for people in themselves, but also for broader economic growth. I think that's that I think we've done a good job on.
Right. No, I agree with you when you say that that this is not something which is necessarily new in the extent that, through the ages, there has been this kind of lack of investment into areas like health and education. Of course, as you said, AAP is turning out to be somewhat of an exception in the current context. But you did call this the new welfareism of the Modi government, and you kind of signaled it as a distinctive shift, which, as you said, is not to prioritize the supply of public goods such as basic health and primary education, as governments have done around the world historically. So in that sense, keeping in mind the historic context, of course, are you seeing more of a shift or somewhat of a break away from the way that this has been done in the past?
Yeah, see, again, let's stick to Indian history, for example, right?
Sure.
I think the UPA government, when they came to power, their approach to this whole set of issues was to create a safety net, essentially, and a rights-based approach to this, which was the Employment Guarantee Scheme, the National Food Security Act, and stuff like the right to education and so on. So that was their approach, and I think, I think especially during the pandemic, some would argue that, while the state has to provide health, education, etc., providing a safety net is considered to be a very legitimate part and a necessary component of what government should do. And so in that sense, some aspect of those safety nets are essentials, and certainly one wouldn't call them freebies as such, because most welfare, most enlightened governments, liberal governments have them. Now, what this government did was to say that they have a different approach to this. Now, I think what is interesting about this approach is that, you see, it's not that, I wouldn't necessarily call all these things freebies, because many of these things are actually what in the old, development literature used to be called basic needs.
Right.
I mean, to provide housing, to provide power, to provide in the modern age, connectivity through bank accounts and so on. And remember, the on the one hand, it has elements of freebiness, but on the other hand, you could say, A, these are also basic needs, and B, there's something universal about, these things that, and one reflection of that, of course, is that women in particular seem to be very happy with all these, the new welfare elements, as it were. And especially if you add drinking water to that, you would say that, every house having drinking water should be part of what states should provide everywhere. So there are aspects of this new welfareism that are, I think, part of what all decent societies should provide as basic needs. But there are also parts of that which are, politically motivated and part of the game of politics. So the thing is that the UPA and this government have done it in different ways. But I think both of them have not really emphasized, health and education in a way that you would like them to. And of course, more recently also employment opportunities, I think, which have also kind of fallen behind.
Right. But, the sort of distinction that, again, because as I pointed out, the center and the Prime Minister and the others in the BJP are not specifying exactly what is this Revdi culture that they're targeting and which party and so on. But one of the things where they do get a bit specific is when they talk about power. And this, because particularly Aam Aadmi Party has been talking about free power. And the sort of rhetoric is that this is bankrupting, the already heavily strained state distribution companies, DISCOMs as they're called, which are heavily in debt by, state governments owe them crores of rupees. They've not been servicing that. And that's kind of draining them. Now, you actually just had a piece out today, in fact, on the state of power sector. Is it fair to link the state of the heavily financially stressed distribution companies to this current wave of free power handouts? Because this is a historic problem, right? It's been going on for years and it cuts across all states, all parties, all governments.
Absolutely. I think it's both true that, Devesh Kapoor, a professor at Johns Hopkins, and I have been doing some research. I mean, if there's one thing that stands out in the last 50 years, it's the power subsidy that's been the biggest subsidy given by state governments and the most draining and contributing to, the deterioration in state finances. Now, the thing is that, at one level, this is a very legitimate concern. The number we have today, it's 1.5% of GDP, the DISCOM losses. Just think about that. If state governments
That's a huge number.
Yeah, huge number. And the thing is that people forget is that, freebies do not lead to free lunches. If you give money somewhere, you're not putting money somewhere else. That's what economists call opportunity costs. And it could be that part of the reason that governments don't provide health and education is because they end up spending too much money on this power thing, and therefore, and it's only been getting worse over time, not getting better in the last 10 years. So I think in that sense, the power subsidy, I would say, so if you were to ask me as an outside expert, after all, we agree that health and education has to be prioritized. But remember, these are state subjects. So I think we have to hold state governments as much accountable as we do the central government.
Absolutely.
So to me, if you were to really address, the freebie thing, the two big, because there is no doubt that even though this is a political equilibrium, it's a political contract between the voters and the rulers saying, the rulers say we give you free power, citizens are very happy. The point is that the power subsidy and the fertilizer subsidy have huge macroeconomic costs, not just economic. They have costs in terms of soil, fertility, health, depletion of the water table, environment, and just not having the resources. So I think that in the Indian political system, somehow or the other, needs to find some ways of addressing, the power subsidy, which is given by the states, and the fertilizer subsidy, which is given by the center.
That's such a, No, sorry. I was just saying that's such an important point you're making, because, just look at that number, just to reiterate, 1% or just over 1% of GDP. I think you estimated it's in the range of couple of lakh crores of...
3 lakh crores. 3 lakh. It's 1.5% of GDP, the discoms.
3 lakh crores.
Yeah. And the fertilizer subsidy at today's prices, in the current budget is going to be, more than 1.5 lakh crores. Historically, it's been about 80,000 crores. Just to put just these two together, and the country is spending close to 2% of GDP on things that have huge costs, because it's not as if we cannot provide these things in different ways that will safeguard whatever they're providing, and yet have the resources to do other things.
And also, because again, it's important to emphasize that, because this has taken on a political overtone, this whole debate, that again, it's everybody, it's across time. We just looked at the states in terms of ranking them in terms of who owes what, and as you'd expect, it's a mix of all states, including BJP run states. Maharashtra currently under the BJP owes about 22,000 crores, UP owes about 8,000 crores, MP owes about 6,000 crores, Karnataka about 4,000 crores, Gujarat 935 crores, so on and so forth. So this is a kind of cross spectrum problem. As it is with handouts, it's everybody. So sorry.
I would say that equal opportunity sinners, one across time, across parties, and across the center and the states. Everyone has been doing this. And so I think instead of pointing fingers, I do think that, there needs to be what I would say is that a renewed bout of cooperative federalism, where the center and the states come together and say, look, let's get together and see these two things that are draining the economy. How do we together do this? Center and the states, what is whose responsibility? And I think this is really a first order problem. This is not the time for finger pointing.
Sure.
One, it's not the time for unelected institutions like the Supreme Court or experts like me to weigh in on this. It has to be political, but it has to be cooperative across parties and between the center and the states.
And in fact, that's so important, because what you point out in that new welfareism piece is that while some of these, whatever word one wants to use, handouts, quick and easy handouts like gas cylinders and bank accounts and so on, have helped. It's increased, financial inclusion of women, and the gas cylinders have helped in terms of, the kind of health benefits of not having wood burning fuel and so on.
Exactly.
You still have a problem like stunting, because when you're not addressing the more complex aspects of how you lift people out of poverty or deprivation, whether through health or education or just overall economic kind of benefits, and the economy generally improves, then their lifestyles improve, and then you get over problems like stunting, etc. Apart from having a healthy and educated workforce, that's really where the focus and the energy should be, and that's really what we should be debating in a way.
Yeah. And we should be debating that, and we should be finding the resources, getting rid of, the bad stuff, as it were. I mean specifically the power subsidy and fertilizer subsidy, and replacing them in other ways, finding the resources and the will to really focus on, health and education, which are important in themselves, but also, for the economy as a whole. I mean, just having everyone educated and healthy is has a lot of intrinsic value, apart from whatever instrumental value it must have.
Right.
But the point is that this has never really happened in our 75-year history on health and education. No, that's not totally right. I mean, we did get with Subsidies Abhiyan and things, we did get a move towards doing that. But I think we've lost that focus. And as we know from all the work that Pratham has done, for example, that although enrollment has gone up,
this
learning
is the
outcomes
NGO that does educate. Sorry, yes, educate. They track education.
Although enrollment has gone up, has been a great success in India, learning outcomes are still very poor on the health side, on the education side.
So tell me, Arvind Subramanian, as we wrap out of time, because you have the advantage of wearing both hats. You had the academic analyst hat, but you also worked in government, so you understand the sort of the dynamics of political decision making. How do you get governments? How do you kind of, in a sense, incentivize them to not just take this easy route of saying, look, we'll just distribute A, B and C, but we will do some of that heavy lifting, get into the complex territory of health and education. Something like AAP has done, interesting model. They waded into it. It does seem to be also coming with political benefits. How does that become a kind of, again, this is not to endorse AAP or anything, but how does one sort of, scale that up?
Yeah, I think we have to do probably a mix of things here. One is that fundamentally, if voters see that if their children are educated and are healthy, and if they kind of reward that politically, as they did with the Aam Aadmi Party, that is kind of the fundamental way to break out of this deadlock. And I think it is happening to some extent. I think other states will follow. The other thing, of course, is that, there has to be a real push from the center and the states. And as I said, there should be more cooperative federalism. For example, the center could say, states, to some extent it's doing that. If you phase out, these power subsidies by thing, you will have more resources and you can spend them on health, education, etc. So you need a mix of things, but fundamentally the political process, has to reward investing in health and education. And that's been very elusive until this Aam Aadmi experiment has come along. So I'm hoping that more parties will see rewards in this in different states, and that's kind of the most promising way forward.
Okay, well, let's hope there's a kind of upside to this whole freebies debate, that it actually has opened up a conversation on it and may actually lead to some rethink and redirection of resources. But it's great to have you on as always, Arvind Subramanian. Thanks so much for taking the time out and speaking to us.
Thanks for having me.